By 1948, the southern economy was in trouble. Its electric power cut off after a dispute with the north, and with rocketing inflation fanning the troubles of the Ri regime. Discontent was high in both town and countryside. There were many guerrillas.
무기라는 게 이 칼빙총 3개.
Our only weapons were 3 carbines and some bamboo spears. Our arms were as poor as that. So we had to raid the police station to get some guns. When I joined, I soon learned that the guerrilla group was composed of those eager to fight and crush Syngman Rhee.
The police were very cruel. They descended where they would. They arrested frequently without warrants. The kind of justice that was dispensed relied very little on rules of evidence. It was not very just, and people were tortured to produce statements for the prosecutors.
There had been continuous guerrilla activity in the south, especially on the island of Jeju. The guerrillas attacked police stations and government offices. In May 1948, the US military governor, General William Dean, flew in to supervise counterinsurgency operations. The guerrillas were mainly poor peasants who'd taken to arms. Their weapons were often crude, but they could be lethal. A cycle of revolutionary violence and reprisal was underway. Some 30,000 people were killed on Jeju. In October 1948, a constabulary unit at Yeosu refused to go there and mutinied. Its American advisors were worried.
You didn't know who you could trust. A unit, before it would send their troops into the Yeosu Rebellion, would probably put some agents into the barracks and sleep with that unit that night, to pick up the barracks chatter to see if they could detect any communists in the midst. Because, you know, you never knew whether when you ordered a unit out, whether it was going to come to your help or come to kill you.
근데 그 반란 사건의 대대장 김지회는 제가
Though Kim Si-hui, the Yeosu Rebels Battalion commander, had been my student when I was principal of the military academy, I volunteered to command the expedition to suppress the guerrillas into the Tsidin Mountains. It hurt and broke my heart when I shot him and the whole battalion. But they were enemies who wanted our country to become communist and were therefore unforgivable. So I annihilated them before returning to Seoul.
The uprising failed. Then, in May 1949, 2 battalions of frontier troops defected north and were welcomed in Pyongyang in their incongruous American-style uniforms.
In March 1947, when I was company commander, I was ordered by the battalion commander, Song Yo-chan, and our American advisor, to suppress the riot in Old Sin in Gangwon province. As it was an order, I got my men into a truck and went to Old Sin. On arrival, I found some 40 peasants gathered there, and an old woman with white hair whose face was swollen by malnutrition. She could not stand hunger any longer, and had come to the county office which had previously taken her grain away, and was entreating them in a pitiful voice to return her food. I asked myself, how can I call them rioters?
Not all South Koreans who went north were army defectors. Some were guerrillas. A North Korean film shows some of them being surrounded and captured. They faced an orchestrated people's court and presumably execution. The North Koreans were early advocates of the power of film. The North gave close attention to its armed forces and their ability to strike hard in the heavy seesaw fighting across the 38th parallel, which increased sharply in the summer of 1949. Sometimes the propaganda unit worked overtime. The real fighting involved thousands of troops and artillery.
Incidents increasingly broke out. And these incidents were feints, if you will. They were never intended as serious invasions, but extremists in the South Korean army, like General Kim Pae-gil or Kim Seok-won and so on, and on the North Korean side as well, would make incursions and would exchange shots, and there was a chain of violence reaching virtually up to the Korean War.
Ri and his top officers, many of them northern exiles, wanted to march north. A letter to his American advisor fell into North Korean hands later.
What Ri was saying to me, and he said it very explicitly and very clearly, is that North Korea should be recaptured by force of arms to fulfill the United Nations mandate that the Republic of Korea government was the only legitimate government on the Korean Peninsula, to fulfill the ancient nationality of Korea. And he went on to make it perfectly clear that it was impossible for him to do anything without the sanction of the American government. He had no arms to speak of, a lightly armed constabulary was all.
Ri had more than that, and the Americans had to keep him in check. The only other surviving politician of stature was Kim Gu. He was assassinated by an army officer with the connivance of the regime in June 1949. America pulled its troops out at the end of June, leaving 500 advisors behind. The Russians, who had already done so, did not expect war.
И полагали, что при отсутствии в Южной Корее
We assumed that in the absence of major American forces in South Korea, no war could break out,
потому что на юге Кореи
because there was a united democratic front of 5 million in South Korea.
демократический фронт, которого корейское
And the South Korean government, without American support, would not venture to start a war.
не решилось бы начать войну.
In March 1949, Kim Il-sung went to Moscow to see the Soviet leaders. Neither side had disclosed Kim's discussion with Stalin, although the memoirs of Khrushchev claim that the possibility of war was discussed.
I cannot exclude that Kim Il-sung may be asked about the position of the Soviet Union, how it will be in case of such a complication or such a conflict there. And I assume that our side has expressed the readiness to help Korea by economic help or maybe some military supplies and so on.
The Cold War was then at its height. Stalin had no formal defense treaty with Kim after Russian troops were withdrawn, but the North Koreans bought over 100 Soviet T-34 tanks. Korea became caught up in the tensions which afflicted Europe. With the Soviet blockade of Berlin and the West's airlift in response, it was the Cold War in Europe which came to dominate much strategic thinking, including that of American Secretary of State Dean Acheson.
Well, Dean Acheson was a brilliant man. His interests really were concentrated in the North Atlantic in terms of his own strong sense of personal commitment. After all, he had played a large role in the building of the Marshall Plan and the construction of NATO, and from a geopolitical point of view, one can understand why this North Atlantic relationship was looked upon as fundamental. He had less interest in the little yellow, brown, black people in various parts of the earth.
Our involvement in Korea was considered unfortunate, and we wanted to leave it. We had set up a Korean government through the United Nations. Not a very satisfactory situation with the country.